Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum, respected colleagues and guests. Welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. My name is Aisha and I'm the forum coordinator at Ummatics. And we're excited to welcome back our regular attendees for this session, as well as those joining us for the first time, albeit a bit belatedly, alhamdulillah. We have an insightful conversation ahead of us today entitled Still Recalling the Caliphate. And among others, we are happy to be joined by the author of the eponymous book, Professor Salman Sayyid. This is our 16th Ummatics Colloquium now, alhamdulillah, which is the regular forum of the Ummatics Institute. And so before we begin, I'd like to invite our founder and chief research officer, Dr. Ovamir Anjum, to say a few words about the Institute for the benefit of those joining us for the first time. So Dr. Anjum, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We are really excited to have Professor Salman Sayyid, who was my host just last Thursday in Leeds on a very snowy day, and we had a wonderful time together. We are really honored to have him. I will let Hannah, inshallah, introduce him further. My job is to simply say something about the Ummatics Institute, which I'm certain many of you know about. I want to draw your attention to our new publication. Our vision is empowering Muslims towards a unified Islamic civilization. And our new publication, What is Ummatics, asks the much asked question, what is Ummatics? This is not a dogmatic response, but an invocation, a provocation, and a response and a request for engagement. What is the Ummatics project? How do we define Ummatics as a concept? What is the Islamic imperative of Ummatic solidarity? What are the implications of this imperative? And perhaps most importantly, how might we consider Ummatics as a discourse within the Islamic notions of revival, ihya, and renewal, tajdeed, that are grounded in the framework of mutual counsel, nasiha, and rendered to the scholars, leaders, and generality of Muslims. You can think of the Ummatics Institute as only one participant in what we call the Ummatics Institute. The Ummatics Institute then can be thought of as a think tank which advises the Ummah at large, with its eyes on the future of the Ummah and its ears to the ground as to where the Ummah stands right now, where it has come from. Our aspiration very much is to not only take the Ummah as a normative construct, which it is very much for Islamic discourse, but also as an analytic category. So as scholars, students of various modern disciplines, as well as our day-to-day discourse, we can think of the Ummah in more real terms. So that's what Ummatics is about. What is Ummatics? Is a proposition to which we ask all of you to think about, join, explore in your own ways, and please join our mailing list and consider your own contribution in various ways to the Ummatics project. Thank you very much, Hannah, for the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum. As Dr. Anjum mentioned, you can find out all about our upcoming papers and the papers we have already published on our website, and you can watch videos of all of our previous colloquia via our YouTube channel. But on to today's event, Still Recalling the Caliphate. The trajectory of Islam in the 21st century is one that has consumed much scholarship, political activism, and religious commentary over the past 100 years. There has been no shortage of analysis on the failure of Islam to follow the trends of other religious traditions in the face of modernity, namely secularization and depoliticization. However, much of this work seeks to address the affairs of the Islamicate and the politics of Muslims in light of the prevailing status quo. In recalling the Caliphate, Decolonization and World Order, Dr. Salman Sayyid seeks to challenge those assumptions and engages critically with the interaction between Islam and the political in the context of a post-colonial world that continues to resist profound decolonization. The book focuses on how demands for Muslim autonomy are debated in terms such as democracy, cultural relativism, secularism, and liberalism. It makes the case that a universalizing approach to the Western experience doesn't just ignore historical examples of previously flourishing Islamic civilizations, but also restricts the very idea that it's possible for a modern Islamic political entity built on a form of Islamic social justice to ever exist. As such, the concept of the Caliphate is only ever suggested as a dangerous Islamic myopia. A discourse on the Islamicate then needs to take place outside of the discourse of colonialism and the machinations of the hegemonic order. Recalling the Caliphate has received widespread praise since its release and been translated into Arabic and Turkish, and the second edition of the book was released just last year by Hurst Publishers. As such, we are honored to be able to have Dr. Salman with us here today to discuss the arguments of the book in light of an Ummatics framing. Dr. Salman Sayyid is a professor of social theory and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds in the UK, where he is also the head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy. He is the founding editor of Reorient, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies, and his wide-ranging work addresses decolonial thought, post-structuralist political theory, analysis of Islamophobia and racism, and historical and relational macro-sociology. We also have two respondents for today's conversation as well. Our first respondent is Dr. SherAli Tareen. Dr. SherAli is an associate professor of religious studies at Franklin and Marshall College, and his research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early modern and modern South Asia. He has also written extensively on the interaction between Islam and secularism. His book, Defending Muhammadan Modernity, received the American Institute of Pakistan Studies 2020 Book Prize and was selected as a finalist for the 2021 American Academy of Religion Book Award. Our second respondent is Dr. Ovamir Anjum. Dr. Anjum is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the University of Toledo, and of course, the founder and head research officer at the Ummatics Institute. After the presentations, we will, inshallah, have our usual Q&A session. All of our attendees can submit questions to the speakers directly using the Q&A box throughout the event, but we also encourage viewers to make use of the general chat box to share their thoughts on the presentations during the actual lectures. Please also look out for our regular polls, which you can use to share your thoughts on what the speakers are discussing. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker for today, Dr. Salman. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd just like to thank Ovamir to see him in flesh and to show his level of commitment for the for Ummatic solidarity. He traveled in a almost virtual snowstorm, but I take the fact that he's used to them, so we're not. But anyway, it was lovely to have him. It was fantastic to have him in the conversation. So I'm really pleased to see him again. And I'm glad that he arrived back safely. I assume he's arrived back safely, but I'm glad for that. Given that there were some technical difficulties, what I'll try and do is compress my remarks to about 15 minutes to preserve a lot more time for Q&A and for Shireen and Ovamir to come back to anything they want to say further on that. So I'm looking forward to the commentary by SherAli and Ovamir as well. So let me try and make sort of three main points, and then I'll spin off from them. So one of the things about still recording the Caliphate is writing the preface for the second edition, which was similar to the preface for the Arabic edition, allowed me to sort of reflect upon two things. One, the change in circumstances, and in particular, the collapse of the ISIS venture, and more importantly, and more significantly, to respond to some of the challenges and difficulties that the book sort of presented and what is expected of it. And there were two things about it which I wanted to bring to attention. One of the things has been that we don't have a very developed and clear sense of politics and the political, which doesn't go beyond the liberal imaginary. And I think that presents a serious challenge. So in a way that the hegemony of liberalism and liberal thought has become so deeply developed that we can't think beyond its limits when we try and think politically. And that has monumental consequences. And one of the consequences of this is that even among, let's say, decolonial scholarship, much of it very impassionate, very energetic, but when you say, what is the purpose of decoloniality? It seems to be sort of a warmed up liberalism at the end of the day. And this is where I would say to you, this is one of the differences that perhaps, I noted that the book was called Decolonization. And perhaps one of the issues about the difference between decolonial thinking and decolonization may be that there is an element of violence, there's an element of power, there's an element of struggle, which goes beyond the epistemological in decolonization for the most part. And so one of the things that Recording the Caliphate had to do, or try to do, is align both epistemological critique with a different way of thinking about the similar problems. So as the book starts off with, it says very clearly that it's divided into sort of two broad, perhaps overlapping sections. One is called clearing and one is called dreaming. And part of the, or if you prefer, critique and reconstruction, or if you really want it to be fancy but annoying, so deconstruction and reconstruction, though I wouldn't advise to saying that. But the idea really was that often when anyone who identifies themselves as a Muslim or wants to talk about the Islamicate, before you can speak, before you have a permission to speak, you have to go through particular kinds of hoops, which often involve these kind of rhetorical and argumentative traps. What about, not just about what about, but also, well, and you know, about the question about liberalism or the question of democracy. Can Muslims be democratic? Can Muslims be liberal? Can Muslims be secular? And these terms are often used without their own historicization. So one of the key things that I think I try to do in Recording the Caliphate is not only talk about historicization as an attempt to return things to a certain genealogical trace, but also through the metaphor of historicization or the methodology of historicization, point out that there may be more than one history to historicize. Because often when the historicization is taken into account, it becomes almost locking it back into the historical roots of basically Eurocentric canon and just saying that it began like that. So to give you a very quick example of this, and I use this elsewhere, but we are basically trapped in a cartography that emerged in the long 16th century. So when people talk about, like, for example, in this conference I was at recently about Islamophobia, and they talk about how Islamophobia happens in Europe and it's meant to keep, and you know, and it happened in Spain against Muslims, etc. There's already a notion that there is a Europe which is a geographical entity rather than a historical entity, that its boundaries are the same as it always has been, and you can project it backwards. And therefore you can bring the opposition between Europe and non-Europe very clearly. And then the task of historicization is just to find out, for example, that Islam has always been part of Europe, rather than find out that Europe is constituted by the externalization of the Islamicate. Now, those are two, it may mean like a small difference, but I think has profound implications. So one of the things is that if we're going to historicize, we're not going very far if our historicization only takes us back to Eurocentric history with its own telos. And I think that's one of the things Recording the Caliphate did. But in doing that, it had to sort of almost develop its own kind of idiom, and which I sort of call critical Muslim studies, and subsequently have tried to develop further and really shift the focus on not Islam, not Muslims, but really the category of Muslimness and how that circulates at different spaces and different places and different time zones. And it's to really start playing around with that rather than simply assuming that it is possible to tell a history of Islam or even the Islamicate or Muslims without actually interrogating that the whole problem is the impossibility of being the whole impossibility of being Muslims through a kind of process of Orientalism and Oriental literature. So the kind of coordinates of critical Muslim study, just to sort of flesh them out, have been really a kind of post-Orientalism, and that I've meant by taking the critique of Orientalism seriously, and then what? And one of the things is this, that Orientalism has, its critique, become quite well established among, senior, sort of junior scholars, graduate schools, where people talk about, everyone's read Orientalism and more or less quote it. And they will say, yes, I'm going to carry out, this is Orientalist. And then what do? They simply repeat it, but they've just said, it's almost like, I suppose, a Catholic confessional or sort of St. Augustine, make me chaste, but not now at this point in time. So yes, I've read Orientalism, but I don't know what that, I will just carry on doing and pretending that I haven't really read it, but I will acknowledge that I read it. So there's a mismatch between having read the critique and then what do you do with that critique? And that's not to criticize people, because in fact that mismatch is there in the book. And I think it exceeds Sayyid's work himself, that in the critique of Orientalism is far more powerful than any of the solutions or resolutions that Sayyid comes up with subsequently anyway. So I think that's one of the things about the post-Orientalists. The second element that I would want to draw attention to, I suppose, would be the question about post-colonial or the decolonial. And again, here it is this attempt to try and bring an intersection between decolonial thinking and the Islamicate. And to do that properly, you need to understand the Atlantocentrism of decolonial thought and to see the challenges in trying to insert Islamicate history into the decolonial narrative with the long 16th century and the idea that the 16th century marks a ruptural moment where you have the establishment of European global hegemony. And again, that is contested. And here I would argue that the Atlantocentrism of much, not all, decolonial thinking also raises problems for trying to tell a truly global history of a decolonial global history or account, because it wouldn't work for the Sinosphere either, etc. So this is a kind of problematization of that. The third, and perhaps the most annoying for some people, would be the post-positivism of that, because post-positivism is so kind of novel and associated with certain ways of thinking which seem to go against the direction of what we understand to be Islamic and Islamicate as well. And the post-positivism is really a suspicion of the idea that the social sciences or humanities or knowledge itself can simply be a patent on a template of the Enlightenment's understanding of the natural sciences. And I think that, again, is something that needs to be, was there, and it produces all kinds of challenges. So in a sense, what I'm trying to argue is the account that emerges from recalling the Caliphate is really one which is anti-essentialist or anti-foundationist to its core. And that is both necessary to do the task of a proper historicization, but I will also say it's necessary to liberate Islam from the metaphysics of presence, which its interpretations have taken a hold of. And that, again, can be challenged, because in a way, what we have is a version of history which sort of goes like this, that everything was essentialist and everything was in its proper place until post-modernity, which then unsettled it and its critique there. And but one could easily suggest that the whole modernist project was a project of essentialization. And in a sense that the world was anti-essentialist before modernity. and it's modernity that's imposed. And that, I think, opens up a little different kind of challenge to thinking about these things. Okay, so that's sort of generalities of this, but I would like to just say a few things. One of the things is this, that the literature on the Caliphate has, for the most part, been dominated with by a history, and a straightforward history. So you can read about the Abbasids, Umayyads, etc. You can read about who did what to when, and also the kind of narrative that, well, the Caliphate comes to an end in 1258. There have been relatively rare accounts which have looked at the Caliphate as a political theoretical object, and in particular its transfer to the Grand National Assembly, or de facto abolition, presenting a problem for political theory. Now, what the odd thing is this, that Muslim thinkers at the time recognized this because they're writing about it all the time. They're writing about, well, what do we do? And the idea that does there need to be an Islamic government, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the kind of dominant narratives of that, it becomes completely missing as anything important or significant. And the argument is, well, you know, by the time that Caliphate was abolished by Mustafa Kemal, it really wasn't doing anything. It wasn't really significant. It wasn't important. It had already finished, etc. And if you don't believe it finished in 1258, it definitely finished with its abolition in 1924. However, only 8 years before, the British and the Italians and other European powers were trying to establish an Arab caliphate. Now, you'd think that if the Caliphate was such a decrepit institution, why is effort being made to set up another version of it? Furthermore, you saw that in various ways that there's a kind of haunting of the Caliphate, but not really talked about it. So in Middle Eastern literature, or if you looked at the history of the contemporary Middle East up till about that time, the Caliphate is hardly referenced, except as this kind of the Islamicist movements are trying to restore an institution which was 80 years old, and this is just a kind of a utopian nostalgia which has no relevance to it. And then I did show how, you know, it starts creeping into the consciousness, so much so that it becomes a marker of Islamist extremism among securocrats of the global north. So from being an institution which is completely irrelevant and not really worth talking about, to something that begins to haunt the collective global imaginary. And of course, then you have ISIS, and again, that just makes the imaginary even more real and more complicated. So one of the things that you will be very disappointed if you read the book, and I don't presume to suggest that this is the only thing that will be disappointing. There will be many things, but one thing that will be disappointing, I can guarantee you that it is not a history of a caliphate. It is not a history or a valorization or a romanticization of a particular institution, or an attempt to argue that this particular configuration or a constitutional charter or something like that could provide it. In that way, I think it is different than many, many other accounts, which are either, like I said, historical accounts, romantic accounts, or accounts in which try to dream up ideal constitutions for the proper caliph. And it doesn't know anything of that. What the book does suggest is the idea of the caliphate as a way, as a metaphor, and a metaphor that requires us to start thinking about the place of Islam in the future, or at least the place of the Islamicate in the future. And that, I think, is a central moment. As I point out, that there are a number of options which are available when we talk about the caliphate. So there's a number of roles. But the one that I think played for most of the time was that as a symbol or a sign or a representation of a great Muslim great power. And that, in a way, anchored the possibility of a Muslim presence in the world. And there are different ways of demonstrating this, and I could do that. But fundamentally, the issue is this. I would argue that the problem right now, if there's a Muslim problem, and again, how you would conceptualize it as problematic itself. But let's put it this way, as I said before, Muslims are too strong to be ignored, but too weak to be accommodated in the world today. As a consequence, they live this kind of limbo status, and everyone has a problem with Muslims because they cannot be accommodated, they cannot be brought into the structures of global participation, governance, legitimate opinion formation, etc. Nor can they be simply ignored and left aside. And it is that challenge which actually, I would argue that one solution is a forever war on a global dirty war forever, or until you break the possibility of an assertion of Muslim identity, or a overarching mechanism of structures which allow the formation of a global Muslim public opinion to have some sway in those structures of the world as, in a however complicated way that can be managed or arranged. And the Caliphate then just simply becomes a metaphor for naming that kind of arrangement. The final point that I want to make with this is that, again, there are criticisms that I make of the various projects of trying to Islamicize things without taking into account that fundamentally what we're dealing with is a political issue. And the one that I fix upon, well, two I want to suggest. One is the whole debate around Islamic economics. If you think about it, as a field of endeavor for the last at least 50 more years, has had many, many very good, very able people working on it, a lot of investment of resources. But its ability to produce anything meaningful apart from Sharia-compliant mortgages, its ability to deal with structural issues of inequality or unemployment or underemployment, or et cetera, have not really borne fruit. Yeah, and you could argue, well, there are many reasons for that, but I think fundamentally that there is a kind of economism and which doesn't acknowledge the role of the political in the formation of economic, not just policies, but economic structures, etc. The second one I wanted to do is really a thought experiment, which is triggered by something that around a reconstruction of the early history of the Muslim political community. If we think of the early Muslim community, if you think about from Abu Bakr's time onwards, let's say, you have a profile which is quite similar to the profile of a number of entities, political entities that emerge from city-states to become imperial structures. But they are actually remain republican, and I want to use that word in inverted commas for the time being, in their formulation. And that means two things. It means that there is no divine right of kings, which in fact, despite what Europeans will tell you, is something that is peculiar to Europe than elsewhere, which means that leadership is always dependent upon acts of legitimacy from popular will or other formations. But in a sense, I would like to suggest is that perhaps we should be thinking about a different way of narrating our own history to capture what we need for the present. And perhaps rather than talking about the first Islamic Empire or the Rashidun or the Umayyads, etc., maybe we should be talking about the first Islamic Republic and see the whole formulation of the Islamic enterprise as working out the logics of a particular kind of Republican thinking. And again, this already has its complications, and I don't have time to go into them. But it's simply that to recognize that the so-called instability, the so-called tensions at the center were actually very productive tensions arising from the fact that no one had the right for rulership, which was not dependent on either obedience to the law or to Sharia, and through the Sharia, the obedience to some kind of legitimacy. It was not that there was a divine right of kings who could rule without any sanction or multiplication. And the reason why this is important is perhaps to move away from the idea of the caliphate being completely consumed within Oriental despotism, and which I think still remains among many the critics who, and among Muslims, good Muslims and bad Muslims and indifferent Muslims, who are often think about the political through the lens of Oriental despotism, even when they recognize that Oriental despotism is an Orientalist construction. So I'll finish there, and just sort of try to sketch out some of the things that's important, and I'm more than happy to have a broader conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salman, for raising some really, really insightful and interesting points there. I'm sure many people are looking forward to that conversation and posing some of their questions directly to you. For now, we'll go to Dr. SherAli for his first response.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much, Ovamir, for inviting me to this wonderful conversation. Great to be speaking again at Ummatics, and thank you so much, Salman, for that wonderful presentation and for that incredible book that I had the pleasure of reading many times, and it's a great pleasure to teach it as well. What I'll do, I'll speak briefly to further emphasize some of the things that Salman has said here, and then maybe pose a couple of questions for discussion. I think, one of the great things about this book, Recalling the Caliphate, is that it talks about some very complicated theoretical problems and some very pressing theoretical problems in a manner which is both conceptually astute, but also very accessible. All the chapters of the book are excellent, but if there is one chapter that I would especially recommend, not only teaching it to undergraduate audiences, but also in terms of these concepts are so ingrained, the idea that the secular is the opposite of the religious, for example, or that religious passions are always more dangerous than secular passions, or the idea that politics is the opposite of violence, and the only way to control the violence emanating from religious excess is the medicine of secular power. These ideas are so ingrained that even with otherwise intelligent people, it can be their working assumptions in terms of the lives they live. So the chapter on secularism, especially in that book, is one I would highly recommend distributing, and just as a way to, I think this is perhaps the most accessible critique of secular power that I've come across, and I would highly recommend teaching it and also distributing it to people who might need that kind of an alteration of perspective on the question of the secular. Which brings me to another point I want to emphasize, something that perhaps Salman did not mention, which is another key category of that book, which is that of Westernese. I think that's a very important and key category of that book, which refer to this family of concepts that gives liberalism and secular power its normative power. Concepts like secularism, liberalism, democracy, all these concepts that then Islam is placed as the other of. And what that book really shows is how these family of concepts come together to exert their normative pressure on what counts as properly political, and through which the caliphate is invariably seen as the other of politics, right? So that, I think, way of conceptualizing this idea of the normative pressure of liberalism and secularism, through which the caliphate and Islam are seen as the opposite of politics, I think is a very useful framing to think about these concepts as not some kind of separate to each other, but rather they operate as a family concepts. And I think that book also offers a very important critique of the secular foundations of the academy. And as Salman was pointing out, that recently this idea of decolonial thinking is in much vogue, but oftentimes these decolonial projects, which are very enthusiastic about critiquing the modern state, very enthusiastic about critiquing Orientalism and colonialism, etc. But they also are unable to rethink the question of the secular, whereby religion is not seen as something which needs to be contained, which needs to be controlled, which needs to be managed, lest its excess overflows and erupts in undesirable forms of politics, or worse, in violence. So the secular foundations of the academy, I think, are provided with a very important and robust critique in Recalling the Caliphate. And it really, I think, if I were to paraphrase its argument, I think what it tries to argue is that there is no possibility of any decolonial politics that is not centered on a concerted intellectual and political project of uninheriting and critiquing liberal secular power. There can be no decolonial politics without a critique and uninheritance of secularism. And that's, I think, an argument which is bound to make many people uncomfortable. And many people who might be self-proscribed, quote unquote, progressives, which I think is the most problematic category that is otherwise used most frequently by otherwise intelligent people, progressing where, progressive according to what measure, this very Hegelian Christian notion of progress to some kind of a utopian future. Invariably, this is a concept imbued with secular power and secular sensibilities. So I think that kind of discomfort that this book will present to secular progressives is a very good kind of discomfort. So I want to applaud Salman on that as well. The couple of questions that I want to raise connect to these comments, which is that recently there is also, one sees this kind of a move or some kind of a trend of trying to excavate and trying to present some notion of the Islamic secular, which is oftentimes presented as a kind of secular which connects with the etymology of this term as connecting to worldly phenomena, or the notion that there has been a distinction between the worldly and the spiritual, or the worldly and the religious. Even in pre-modern Muslim thought, even in the Prophet's own life, you might have distinguished between the worldly and the religious, so on. And so there's this measure of trying to arrive at, or trying to form some kind of a notion of the Islamic secular. Now, I find that to be a problematic move, this idea of excavating an Islamic secular, because no matter how much you might think about a notion of worldliness as representing the secular, ultimately secular power, in the sense that we're talking about it today, is inextricable to the sovereignty and to the inextricable contradictions of modern state sovereignty. But I would be curious to hear about Salman's views on that. Is there a possibility that one can reorient, no pun intended, that just came out as I spoke, to reorient the notion of the secular such that an Islamic secular could be conceived of? Or this category is so saturated and so soaked in the blood of Enlightenment thinking that that kind of a project of reconceiving the secular so as to turn it into an Islamic secular is problematic from the point of departure or not? I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this particular question. The other thing that this book does that perhaps I think Salman did not have the time to talk about is that it really talks about a certain notion of history that relies on the erasure of the colonial moment as being absolutely critical to how we think about the relationship between Islam and politics today. So I remember in the podcast that we did a few years ago, Salman, when I interviewed you on the New Books Network for this book, it was a very powerful moment when you talked about ways in which the history of politics in Islam is oftentimes told as if you have a jump from the early 7th century and all the way to the present. And that thing that happened in between the 18th and 19th centuries, that colonial moment, that colonial power and its violence, is oftentimes erased from these narrations of the relationship between Islam and politics. So I think that critique that this book offers in terms of the way we periodize our own past, the way we really think about the very distinction between different periods and what kind of histories get erased and what kinds of histories get mentioned and noticed in historical accounts of world history, are deeply imbued and saturated with a certain kind of an Enlightenment project of what counts as properly historical. So in some ways, I see the book making the argument that recalling the Caliphate also means re-energizing and reappropriating is an alternate notion of history that does not rely on this kind of an erasure of the violence of colonialism. One or two other questions I just want to raise, and something you mentioned today also in your talk, Salman, which is that in this book, I want to go to the title of the book, Recalling the Caliphate. And you make it quite explicit in the book and today as well in your comments that you approach the idea of the Caliphate in this title as a metaphor for the potentiality of Muslim politics. That there is no some kind of an ideal caliphate that you're after. And you even mention it as some kind of a romantic notion of being after a certain kind of template of the caliphate from historical time or from the present. But it really operates as a theoretical metaphor through which avenues of rethinking the political open up for you, and through which the juggernaut of liberal secular power can be critiqued. So Caliphate in this book operates almost as a potentiality that never quite crosses into actuality. This is some kind of a sovereign category here, that there is a potential of the political that does not quite find an actual template. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about this. Theoretically, the operation of the category of the Caliphate in your book, in your work, in this larger project of critical Muslim studies that you have been pioneering for a number of years now. What do we make of a potential that never passes over into actuality? And there, I think perhaps, since the whole theme of this conversation is thinking about still recalling the Caliphate according to an Ummatics framework, I think that's where there is some tension, if I might spell it out. I know you and Ovamir had a very good time last week, so I don't want to, disturb the camaraderie here, but I think there is a potential tension there. In that the Ummatics, even in the brief description that Ovamir offered before we began, there is a very clear, from what I understand and from what I read, push to thinking about the political in very concrete ways as some kind of a platform through which Muslims can be brought together in a joint venture of politics. So I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of the Caliphate as a metaphor, and what kind of tension does it sit with in terms of thinking about an actual template of the Muslim politics and of the Caliphate. And more specifically on that question, I think the whole question of how to overcome the juggernaut of the modern state. And how do we think about the place of Muslim intellectual traditions, Muslim intellectual histories, that were oftentimes bound to a particular context of Muslim imperial sovereignty before the colonial moment? So how do we read that whole heritage and that whole tradition? I know this is a massive question, but I just want to raise it here. How do we read that whole heritage of Muslim intellectual traditions that are bound to a particular political context of Muslim imperial sovereignty that took different forms, of course, in different contexts? But that context is no longer there with the emergence of the modern state as being the primary fulcrum of politics in the modern world. So how does one, with the metaphor of the Caliphate, engage this juggernaut of the modern state and engage the rich and complex heritage of Muslim intellectual traditions, but that were yet bound to a Muslim imperial context that is no longer there? So that, I think, is a central conceptual and political challenge that this book has us think about, but I would like to hear more from you in terms of what you think about this challenge and this tension of how to confront it. And in some ways, I'm also pushing you to think about the relationship between the kind of political theory that you're doing and the kind of sociology, politics that you're doing, and the textual, philological labor of Islamic studies. So from this plane of the political conceptual problem to the plane of as a zone of inquiry, what kinds of conversations, what kinds of cross-pollinations do you see between these two kinds of labor, these two kinds of analytical, intellectual labor, in terms of rethinking the political, so that Islam is thought about as properly political and not just as the other of politics? I think I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Dr. SherAli. You've raised some really great points there, and look forward to hearing Dr. Salman's response. Last but by no means least, we'll come back to you, Dr. Anjum, to give your response.
Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah. So first of all, thank you very much, Salman, for your comments, and then SherAli for saying almost everything I wanted to say much better than I would have said. And I almost want to cede my time and let Salman respond, but because Hannah would not be happy with me if I did that, I will go ahead and repeat some of the points. So first of all, I want to express my gratitude to Salman. His first book, published in 1997, A Fundamental Fear, was an important read for me in graduate school. And it was a lonely contribution at the time, where a voice that was confidently post-structuralist, anti-foundationalist, but also one that was challenging the very powerful narrative, which people who went to school after that era wouldn't recognize perhaps as much, the power of fundamentalism as a word. Islam was called fundamentalism, right? And Islamism was seen as a category of fundamentalism. And so that book did a great service in challenging that. And recalling the Caliphate, in some ways, I see that as continuation of that project. But it adds something more, right? And in talking about the Caliphate, even as a metaphor, what Salman does is open up the possibility of it's a more constructive intervention that we can, in fact, move independently of the both the liberal imperial gaze as well as perhaps the Muslim reaction, which seems to be bound by very presentist concerns, that you could talk about the Caliphate, yet talk about it as a metaphor, yet talk about it in a way that, you know, if you look at those 8 chapters that appear in recalling the Caliphate, there is very little of Caliphate there, but there is resonance. There is talking about why we can think of liberalism and democracy and anti-foundationalism and postmodernism and even Star Trek and Dune, while thinking about Muslims as Muslims. So I think that was really powerful to me. And for me, SherAli's comments are very welcome, that there is a gap between us. But at the same time, I want to stress that, you know, in my article that I published in 2019, that in some ways inaugurated this effort, I speak about, because I'm compelled to speak about the idea of, you know, this asymptotic ideals, because in my view, Caliphate must be a metaphor, even if it is a reality. It still must be a metaphor, right? It's a conceptual space. We wouldn't know as people what to do with it, how to hold it accountable, what to expect of it, if we did not have that conceptual space, if we did not have that metaphor. I also want to stress the other point that SherAli made, and one that I myself have thought about while reading and teaching Recalling the Caliphate to my graduate students, which is there is a lot of clearing, there's a really courageous questioning, but there is almost there is room left for construction, which when I talk to Salman and here, there's almost a recognition that that's there, that the decoloniality does help us, but it's also almost used instrumentally, that it sort of does leave us cold a little bit, and then we need to do more. So let me pursue that a little bit. And I will do that with a quote in the book, very important quote, and to me also by a man, somebody that I had great respect for, I have great respect for, which is the following. This appears in his chapter on liberalism, in which Professor Salman Sayyid quotes Wallerstein to talk about this idea of universalism. And here I read, "Universalism is a gift of the powerful to the weak, which confronts the latter with a double bind. To refuse the gift is to lose, to accept the gift is to lose. The only possible reaction of the weak is neither to refuse nor to accept, or both to refuse and accept. In short, the path of the seemingly irrational zigzags, both cultural and political, of the weak that has characterized most of 19th and especially 20th century history." Wallerstein said this in 1991. Now, what's interesting to me is, what are the implications of this double bind? So the West presents a universal account of the world, of reason, of justice, And it is something that the colonized, the native, the parochial, the provincial natives have to either accept or reject. If you accept universalism, you are accepting the West. You are accepting the Western gaze. You are accepting Western knowledge. You are no longer who you were before. But if you reject it, then you're accepting your parochiality. You're accepting your place in the ethnic aisle in the grocery store, if you will, that there is a universal, general, neutral, but then colorless, if you will, existence that is normal, but then you can opt into something more ethnic, something more limited, something parochial. So we can neither therefore accept it nor reject it. But what I've been thinking about is that what happens when we accept this dichotomy, or perhaps when we accept Wallerstein's recommendation that all that's left for the native, if you will, or the decolonial thinker or activist is incoherence, zigzag, if you will. Sometimes accept universalism, speak in universal terms that have been bequeathed to them, and other times hold, if you will, hold up the identity card and parochiality and nativism. Now, what's interesting to me is that it's correct to observe, especially for somebody like Wallerstein, that this is what third worldist movements seem to have been doing. But this precisely, in my view, is what leads to what Professor Salman Sayyid noted, which is that it ends up being, as in the case of Edward Said, just sort of warmed over liberalism, same notions, but basically perhaps reformatted. So my concern is then, what is an alternative to incoherence? Because you see, incoherence itself, between universalism and forms of parochialism, incoherence itself, I think, is a recipe for that acceptance of universalism. We cannot live without universalism. And so what tends to happen is that even the path of zigzag that we choose, right? If there is nothing to guide that resistance, if you will, then that zigzag is determined by nothing but a negative, but what we do not want to be. By our North Star, if you will, remains the West. It's just that we're trying to avoid it, but there is no way for us to narrativize coherently what is it that we are doing and pass it on to our next generations, or even to explain to ourselves. And so in my view, the need for what SherAli you called for is, or pointed to, need for a more thick commitment to Islamic tradition. And so rather than Islam as a foil for critique, Islam as the place for standing, not merely Muslimness, but Islam as a thicker commitment is necessary. Otherwise, I fear that the apprehensions that you both have expressed about where decoloniality might end up tend to come true. So with that, I will say, recalling the Caliphate was in many ways the call that inspired me to think about how to think of this metaphor very much as a metaphor, not against it being a metaphor, not as somehow a retort to it, but rather to say, well, how do we live with metaphors, and what does it mean for this metaphor to be what I call an asymptotic ideal? And I explore that in some of my writing. So thank you very much, both of you, again, for thinking with us, thinking with me, and for teaching us so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum, for your thoughts there. I am keen to open it up to the discussion, but Dr. Salman, is there anything in particular perhaps that Dr. SherAli or Dr. Ovamir have said that you would like to just respond to quickly before I open it up to many more questions, I'm sure?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank both of them. I think it's been very helpful to have them present these very thoughtful questions and this very thoughtful summary, and I am in debt to their acumen in reading these things. The only point that and these are really important questions, and I hope there will be in Q&A ability to respond to many of them. One thing that perhaps I might want to say very quickly here is part of what I wanted to do and what I try to do is use a lot of the distinction between the ontological and the ontic, especially in talking about Islam, for example. And my argument would be very simple, that for most Muslims, most of the time, Islam remains an ontological entity, that in a sense that it transcends any specific manifestations. This is why we can say things like, even though we know someone prays 5 times a day, but you may be able to say, well, he's not a good Muslim because he's a drug dealer or something like that. And these sorts of things are always possible. There's a way of thinking about being a Muslim which transcends any of this kind of ontic manifestations. And I think that's an important distinction, and I think it will come to play on that. But I think I would agree about the Caliphate being a metaphor, and I think Ovamir is right. But I would argue that we're always living in metaphors. I don't really think there's much, the literal content of what we're dealing with is in ordinary language or in life is not that great, in the sense that everything can be metaphorized, and there is always a certain moment that it is. And then the question becomes is how is the battle where the lines are drawn between what can be considered literal for how long, and what it cannot be considered literal, and that I think is a process of contestation. But I mean, really, these would require a much more detailed response, which I'll be more, and I'll be happy to do that. But in your decision to open it up to questioning, I'll confine my remarks to that at this moment in time.
Okay. All right, brilliant. Thank you. We'll, inshallah, open it up to the floor, and I'm sure we'll get more of that discussion going. Okay, so thank you to all of the speakers thus far. In terms of how the Q&A session works, we obviously have panelists and attendees. Our panelists should be able to raise their hand if they have a question and pose their question or comment to the relevant speaker directly. Please do try and keep your questions concise. I will have to start cutting people off around the 2-minute mark. And as for our attendees, you can use the Q&A box to submit your questions, or you can also request to unmute yourself, and one of the hosts will unmute you and allow you to pose your question directly. So we have had a couple, I think, of written questions and a few people who said that they would like to ask a question. We'll come to Brother Haldoon first.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody, and thank you, Professor Salman, for this amazing book. And it's a pleasure and honor to meet you. Well, I have 3 questions basically. Quickly, the first one is, you mentioned that one of the ways to see Islam is as our way to write a history of a post-Western future. So my question is that how can we do that? How can we write history of a post-Western future? Second question, you mentioned that if you believe in the ethical, you must also believe in the political. So my question is, do you think this century will witness a different kind or version of the interplay between the ethical and the political that is different from the last century? And the last question, you talked about what you said, the mark of Islamic, that like pre-modern scholars didn't do Islamic philosophy, they just did philosophy and so on. So you also said that this marking leads to the Oriental essentialization, particularization, and depoliticization of Islam as a religion. And then you concluded by saying that removing the mark facilitates imagining the future rather than recovering the past. So the big question here is, how can we remove this mark of the Islamic? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, this is a good opportunity to respond to one of the points that Ovamir made, and also some of the points that SherAli made as well. So I think the first thing, in terms of all of these questions, how to write a history of the post-Western, how can we remove the remarks, I think turn to the point that, I put it that there's a lot of clearing, but not much dreaming in recording the Caliphate. And I think there's an element in which there's, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but I would say this way. I think part of it is that, in a way, how to actually, and SherAli, you talked about the potentiality of the Caliphate versus its actualization and how to cross over the threshold. So let me be very clear. I'm not one of these people who think that the whole thing is to keep everything in a suspended state of potentiality. It is not for me in that sense, this kind of forever suspension, because any kind of move towards actuality would be exclusionary, which would mean hard decisions, etc. It seems to me this is often taken that, a part of the literature is that people should just be a permanent opposition. And I don't think being a permanent opposition is a healthy state. And I think that quite literally, if there was a stronger, more powerful, more complex, more committed Muslim overarching structure, then I think the fate of the Kashmiris, the Muslims in India, the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, the Palestinians could be materially different, as a minimum. Let's put it that way. Yeah, that would be. So I think this thing about where we should remain suspended in case we become like our worst enemies, I think that's not my case. So the question is that how do we move from potentiality to actuality, and why I don't do this in the book. I think partly it is my deeply held belief, which I'm happy to change if the right argument comes along, is that the actual work of translating into actuality requires a different kind of thinking. It requires strategic work. It requires political work in specific contexts. And I'm not sure that recalling the Caliphate would be the place to do that, or would have been able to do that. Every author has the kind of naive dream that all I need to do is write the book and then shake that book and the foundations of injustice would collapse or something like that. But I don't have those illusions at all. So I think there is a real issue about how you translate from potentiality and actuality. And I think that is more of a prudential task rather than a kind of a conceptual task, if I could put it like that. And I think that's where I would put it. And I think that still makes the same point that Ovamir, you made, that again, that the clearing itself allows the dream, but I think the dreaming is, the problem is that I don't think that some Muslims don't really have dreams. I think they have the possibility of dreams in order to allow them to dream. Now, how you translate those dreams then into reality, in meaningful reality, I think it requires different kind of creative work. And I think I concede that. And the reason why I mentioned this, Haldun, is because all of your questions about how to write the history of the post-Western and how to write, how to do the unmarking, I don't have one solution for that, because it really would depend on a particular context. It would depend on the balance of forces. It would depend on what you want to do. The point that I would make in relation to all of this is that I think tactical flexibility is essential. But tactical flexibility can only be meaningful if there is a strategic commitment to a particular end. Otherwise, tactical flexibility becomes an end in itself, and you don't actually get anywhere. And I think that's really the challenge that we have to deal with. That if you are convinced or aware of your overarching goal, then how you get there can be you can be flexible in it. It's like this: if you know where you want to go and you're driving along, you can choose different routes, you can choose different paths depending on what's most expedient. If you have no idea where you're going, it doesn't matter which route you take, you'll always not get there. So I think it's basically recovering that sense of qibla, the sense of direction, and having that very outlined. And I think, one of the things I take for the Ummatics project is a kind of very conscious effort to think about the nation or the nation state not as a end in itself, and to think about there may be another destination. And then that opens up, well, how do we get to that destination in those specific questions and circumstances, which may vary depending if you're in Kashgar or in Gaza or in, Tehran. I mean, I think one has to allow for those kind of localities, etc. So that's how I would answer the question. And the thing about will there be different ethics and politics, Altoon? The short answer is I don't know. It really depends on what you do. I'm leaving it up to you to sort out a different ethics in relationship with politics.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. Dr. Anjum or Dr. SherAli, would either of you like to come in on that note?
That's okay. We can move on.
All right, that's great. Let's go then to Brother Hamad. Brother Hamad Yasser. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question now.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam.
I'm from India. So my question is precisely that how a Muslim living in a secular nation state, where being a Muslim in a minority condition, how can he think of Caliphate as a metaphor? Or precisely what I want to say, as Professor Salman Sayyid has mentioned in his book, that Muslim redemptiveness, Muslim return is not about some homeland, but about rooting in the world. So how the Muslims living in a minority status in a secular nation state can root, how can he imagine about the Caliphate? Again, it's also about the subjectivity. As you mentioned in your book, that Muslim subjectivity, there is no overarching political structure that can represent the Muslim subjectivity. So if we consider the Muslim stand, then it might, I can relate something to how I can imagine about Muslim subjectivity beyond nation state. But as in a secular nation state, in a minority status, how can we think about, how can we articulate this Muslim subjectivity? And second point is that, as SherAli Tareen himself pointed, that the problem with the nation state that is somehow colonized the spaces given to self and subject and sovereignty. So how could we think about the Caliphate without going beyond this nation state? Even the more problematic is that how could we think in the nation state about going beyond the nation state? These basically two questions that I want.
Thank you. Let me answer the second question first, because again, at first what SherAli says, I think it really reverts, the answer depends on a theory of the state, or the theory of the modern state. I am not in agreement with Halak that the modern state only has one particular formulation or possibility. So if you look at the literature in the 1980s or 70s, which would talk about the capitalist state,
Dr. Salman, I think you muted yourself accidentally.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I can't hear you now, so let me just finish this part there. I don't know what's happened, but you can hear me. Yes, just nod your head if you can hear me. Okay. I think so. Firstly, let me say this, that it seems to me that you're absolutely right, that to think about the Caliphate, or think about the Ummatic, or to think about a Islamic state, or think about a different kind of configuration of the modern state, it means reconfiguring it. And I think that is a work of creative work, but I don't think it's an impossibility. I think you can imagine different kinds of regimes. To give you a very quick example, you could argue that we have basically a capitalist economy, which is ranges across, from Japan, Germany, United States, etc. But you can also see how capitalism in each of those countries is done quite differently and has different experiences in relation to the level of state intervention and question of how you, and like I mentioned in the Caliphate, building a bridge in Canada or building a bridge in Germany is a different exercise. So the whole debate for me is that there are things that could be investigated. We shouldn't just simply think that the modern state is something that we need to inherit and we cannot work on. It's a question about how do we rework some of those structures to produce an outcome which isn't exclude the possibility of the Islamicate, but actually inscribes and underwrites it. But I think that's possible. I think the question about how Muslims can live as a minority, well, one thing I would remind you all, that at least until about 300 to 400 years after the beginning of Islam, Muslims lived as a minority. So the question isn't about living as a minority per se, it is the status of that minority and how that works out. And again, the idea of living as a minority producing particular challenges, yes, but it seems to me that those challenges would be more complicated if you don't think beyond the national boundaries that make you into a minority. Being a minority is not a matter of fate. It is actually a matter of how we do the counting. And you produce minorities by drawing boundaries. And if you think that there are 200 million Muslims in India, let's say, and that's a minority. But if you think there are 2 billion Muslims in the world, then it's not a minority. So I think this is the kind of why I think the project of the thinking about these things is really about not allowing those limits to become the limits, not for a critical reflection, but also for the future work that we may want to do with them. And that is the whole point of trying to think beyond those limits that can imprison us, both metaphorically and often literally. Now we're going to have a little problem because I cannot hear you and you can hear me. The only thing I can suggest is that I try going back again and calling on that. So that might take a few minutes, but if that seems to be the best way of doing it, and I forgive, please talk amongst yourselves, and I'm sure you find better answers. It'll take me a while to do that. Okay.
You sure you can't hear us? Can't hear us. Okay.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Anjum, would you like to come in on that, and we'll do other questions, perhaps that aren't.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to be very quick. I want to simply reaffirm what Salman said, but in my own way, which is that the idea that we live in nation states. What is a nation state? Is it a timeless entity, right? That we can, is it something that we can touch and see? It isn't, right? Nation state itself, if you look at the actual kind of institutions that get called nation states, they have been changing, they have been transforming. We are told that the nation state starts 1648 Westphalia, and until today, nation state is the engine of modernity. But in reality, those nation states in the 17th and 18th century were very, very different. They were absolutist states. Nobody that I know today in the modern world wants to be part of that nation state or thinks that that nation state has survived. And then much of 19th century, early 20th century, were the entire world was covered by empires. There was no nation state. Majority of people in the world did not have citizenship status. They were subjects of empires. And so only after the Second World War that we can talk about what looked like nation state, because United Nations was created. But then you had Cold War, and during the Cold War, sovereignty of these nation states didn't really mean much to either the US or the USSR. In nearly every country, every third world country or developing country was, suffered regime change operations and constant interference. There was no sovereignty, right? How can you have a nation state in that ideal without having sovereignty? There were only a few states that could affirm sovereignty in the world, like handful of them, and the rest were still subjects in. So my point simply is that this notion that nation state has survived for centuries and it's a reality, some an ontological reality, if not an ontic reality. That's not the case. Nation state has been changing. And finally, the last episode of nation state is starting 1980s, where with neoliberalism and globalization, the fundamental function of the nation state was no longer to give fundamental, primary or identity to its citizens, and but rather to protect the interests of money, of large-scale, multinationals, and sort of serve as gatekeepers of those arrangements. The kind of loyalties that people had when they went to First and Second World War do not exist anymore. The nation state has once again changed after, the Second World War, right? Only after 30 years. So basically what I'm trying to say is the nation state is and to reaffirm what Salman said, that Halak's idea that nation state is it has these form properties and it has it has survived throughout modernity, or rather has created modernity. It needs to be questioned, even when one is sympathetic to Halak's account. His description of the nation state leaves so much to be desired. There are many Muslim countries today, particularly, that are not real nation states, that are trying to be nation states. Saudi Arabia was not a nation state. They're trying hard to be nation states. So basically, my point is that when we think about, against the nation state or critiques of nation states, people tend to think that it is as if we are critiquing water or air. That's not the case.
No, I mean, I caught towards the end of that, and I agree with Ovamir, what you're saying, exactly that, that we shouldn't think of the nation state as a continuous entity. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have particular kind of articulations and mechanisms and means of that, but it doesn't mean that you can't do anything. All of us can imagine better configurations of the relationship between state and society, between powers and mechanisms, and that I don't think is difficult to do. And also there's a kind of within Halak, so there's a kind of a Eurocentric claim, which, people like Quentin Skinner and others made, that basically the state only emerges in Europe in 16th century Europe with the difference in the wars of religion. But, state-like structures or political societies, if you want to kind of have existed since the Sumerians at least. So I don't think that is a very strong argument, because it doesn't allow for the fact that there can be different forms of political societies, and there is no reason to assume that you couldn't have another formulation which would accomplish some of the things, but it would also transfer some of the things.
Okay, great. Alhamdulillah. We have just under half an hour left and quite a few questions. So I'm going to try and get through as many of these as possible. We have a question on Pakistan. We have a couple of questions actually on Pakistan, and Dr. SherAli, perhaps you would also like to come in on this. Firstly, how do the speakers see the unfolding of the clearing and dreaming in Pakistan at this particular juncture, especially where there seems to be an ideological hegemony of Kemalist intelligentsia opposed to the popular mobilizations in the country against the traditional ruling elite?
I think the questioner has put it very well. That's exactly the situation of clearing and dreaming. There is a Kemalist hegemony, a Kemalist kleptocracy. The situation has become far more clearer because there's no doubt in most people's mind that that is a Kemalist kleptocracy anyway, which includes higher echelons of the establishment as well. And we will, it is something that needs to be played out. Now here is where the question of tactical flexibility or tactical acumen really comes into it, that one could argue that, what is the best way? Was it a good idea to dissolve the assemblies and lose the power from the protection, etc.? These are really real-time decision-making, and they have to work in the context of what's going on. But I certainly think that what is what awaits Pakistan, in a sense, is either LCC option or something which is other than that. In other words, that this is part of this, because it's quite clear that the agenda of the Communist kleptocracy is to align itself slavishly with the absolutist order which has emerged after the so-called Arab Spring. So I think the dreaming and clearing is absolutely there. So we need to do the clearing so we can put the dream Pakistan properly. That, I think, would be one of the arguments. But I don't know if SherAli may want to come in and dream something else or clear something else.
No, that's very well put, Salman. I'll just add this situation also shows the intimacy between the relationship between Islamophobia and a certain kind of fear of the excess of Islam and Kemalist logic and sensibility. So clearly at work here is not just some kind of an anti-establishment actor who's seen as problematic for the establishment's political aspirations and its alignment with US imperial power, but clearly at work is also some kind of a modernist mandate whereby you have an actor who's seen as overly, prone or gullible to religious excess. So I think this intimacy between secular sensibilities or secularity and how that sometimes gets manifested in very brute ways through the imposition of state power is seen very clearly in this context. So I think that whole argument of the book also about the intimacy between liberalism, modern state sovereignty, and its exercise and secularity is seen in very clear ways in this context, and how the left, broadly speaking, in many contexts as well, can be so morally, or certain segments of it.
Morally flexible, you were going to say, SherAli?
Say it again?
Morally flexible? Was it the word morally flexible you were going to say?
I was going to say morally corrupt.
Morally flexible? Oh, I see. Okay.
Stopped in my tracks, but
flexible sounds. But this gives me an opportunity to actually address the question you asked about Islamic secularity. I would be harsher than you in this occasion and say it's an oxymoron, because partly it's based on the idea that what secularity meant is a separation between state and church. And as I point out in the book, this is not actually what happened when it has been tried outside the world of Christendom, and actually Roman Catholic Christendom. So in every single case, it doesn't mean the separation between state and mosque, as the sort of journalistic accounts put it into, but the state taking over all other institutions. And that's not just that's for the first problem. Secondly, I think the idea of secularity depends on trying to excavate particular things that say are not particularly, well, this is not Islamic. But the whole point is that this depends on the understanding, and this is Al-Assad's point, of Islam as being a religion which has a particular domain, and therefore you can extract from it. And it is just not feasible to sustain that. So I think a lot of it is a very shallow possibility, and it often just is an affair of what I call prefixes, that you just put Islamic in front of something and it becomes halal. And I'm not sure that it works like that. So I would agree with you. I just don't see that it is a particularly useful exercise because it doesn't have much depth to it. It's simply, well, we know that the Muslim sultans used to drink alcohol. They had different kind of, yes, but what? That doesn't make them secular. It's only us that mark that morality as a marker of secularity. That, I think, is a key point here. And people, so I think those are, we don't have that notion what constitutes a particular kind of behavior as being independent of that kind of Western discussion of what is secular and what is religious. Religion is what you do in a particular place at a particular time. And if you don't have those notions of religion, then it seems to me that the whole idea of here we can mark out what is secular and what is not, it becomes, if not meaningless, at least unhelpful.
Okay, great. Let's try and take a couple of questions and let people have their say, inshallah. I'll come to Brother Shahid and Sister SherAli together. So first we'll go with Brother Shahid, and then after he's finished, please go ahead, Sister SherAli.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Shahid from Kashmir. So when I actually first read of Salman's book, I did not read recalling the Caliphate as a metaphor. I took it as a creative part of various interlinked processes that are attached to the grand thing called Caliphate. So I am a professor of political economy of Islam. So I take things in economic perspective per se, because I think there is much in the epistemology with regards to political, what is political, what constitutes political. And we have critiques of Western notions starting from Westphalia to current. But from economic perspective, do you all, particularly Ovamir Anjum and SherAli Tareen also, think that we currently in Islamic economics as a discourse in the current literature have a research gap where our scholars have not critically engaged with liberal capitalist models? Like, are there some insights in the economic epistemology of West which might inform our understanding of how we can have a performative effect of our Islamic economic as a system? Like currently there's a debate going on ESG. It's all throughout the world. ESG is the buzz right now. Islam has the model of sustainability in itself. Do scholars lack in sort of critiquing or understanding how West has informed our economic philosophies? And two, is it that our models of developing sustainability or Islamic economics per se, is it that the state has not been mentioned as much, how state informs economic processes or economic institutes? Like, for me, that is the biggest question to tackle Islamic economics in the larger grand scheme of things, of understanding Caliphate, not just as a metaphor, but as something of interlinked processes. I would love to hear from you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Shahid. Sister SherAli, if you would like to just pose your question within a minute or two.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be as quick as I can because it's actually already been posed. So not much to add. It is about Pakistan, actually. And I think the angle that I could perhaps bring in just to add a little bit of diversity is the points that have been raised about the limits of decolonial thought, how it often kind of lapses into another variant of liberalism, firstly, and secondly, the point about, abstractions and metaphors versus concrete instantiations of those metaphors. So Imran Khan in many ways epitomizes the limits of the decolonial. He is very much a liberal who, he's sort of, his big ticket is the rule of law, constitutionalism, institutionalism. But yet he talks about the Riyasat of Medina. He's taken a very bold stand against Islamophobia. He often attacks sort of, Western liberalism or Western liberals within, or brown sahibs, as he calls them within Pakistan. So he's a bit of, he does epitomize those tensions. However, he's also said absolutely not to having, US bases within Pakistan, to Pakistan being a sovereign state, which is not aligned, which doesn't really bother with trying to side with either power. So he's not really a radical, and yet, whatever he says has been absolutely incendiary to the extent that it's triggered this sort of, thinly disguised military coup against him, which brings the military, 13 political parties, and virtually the entire kind of.
Sister SherAli, if you could just sort of pose your question.
Yeah, collective of progressive secular liberals. So what I'm saying is that is there any point in drawing a distinction between what happens on the intellectual level, i.e., the limits of decolonial thought as it appears in books, etc., and what is actually happening in the real world, given what is going on in Pakistan now, which is very, very serious.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Dr. Salman, would you like to start us off? Yes.
Yeah, very quickly. Firstly, my position on Islamic economics hasn't changed since the first edition of Recalling the Caliphate, and I don't think so. That's the first thing. Secondly, just to clarify, we've got ourselves into a tangle about the idea of the metaphor of the Caliphate as a metaphor. I will just make 2 points. I did say to everyone that the book, and therefore my involvement in the book, is post-positivist, which means that really the metaphor, I would dare anyone to name something which cannot be a metaphor. So I think the problem isn't that whether it is or it is not, but the point is that what I was trying to get at by talking about the Caliphate as a metaphor is not to denigrate it or to weaken it or to think that it's not important or significant, but that it doesn't necessarily need to stand for something particularly always, to move away from the idea of the Caliphate that you can actually write out its attempt to trace it or project it into the future from the past without just as a kind of direct translation. So I think that's the point that I would make. In relation to the point from Sister Shera, I think I would probably agree. I would agree with most of it. I think the issue here isn't just the kind of legalism tradition, etc., but I think it's a general kind of challenge that to bring about something new and within the constraints of what is possible or what you think is possible, requires a degree of, it does require a degree of political theoretical thinking which allows you to think beyond those limits. And I think that's something which is difficult to do while you are caught in that state, but it's a necessary thing. So I don't have any illusions about who gets to play what part they do in particular history. I think what is interesting is that despite all these attempts, why is it that there has been such popular mobilization around, at this moment, around this overthrow? And what is it that have made spread the notion of a certain kind of awareness which has gone beyond the usual circles of Pakistan? I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that, but that's how I would see it. It's actually worth explaining how this happened, because no one from Rawalpindi or in Lahore or in London expected this would be the outcome. This was going to be, that is, I think, something that's worth commenting upon.
Dr. SherAli, would you like to come in?
Very briefly, just I think that the intimacy between U.S. imperial power and secularism as a normative project, I think, needs to be foregrounded, and the relationship between colonialism and secularity, of how certain kinds of sensibilities that perhaps try to think about Islam as political or having some kind of notion of socioeconomic justice grounded, for example, in the values and ideals of the Medinan community, etc., how these kinds of religious sensibilities are seen as threatening to a certain kind of a imperial secular sensibility that has centers in US and it's a different kind of organs like think tanks, etc., but can also appropriate state power through machineries and mechanisms such as the military establishment in a context like Pakistan. So I think it really, this example further reinforces the relationship between secularity as a kind of sensibility and secularism and modern state sovereignty as a form of political power.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, we have a couple more questions related to Pakistan that have been submitted as written questions. If I can ask both of them together, then perhaps we can lay the Pakistan topic to rest and perhaps come back for one final question before we end. So Ovamir Karim asks, there has been a lot of criticism on the colonial origins of blasphemy laws in Pakistan, and an overwhelming majority of Muslims within the country support these laws. In this backdrop, where does the decolonization project fit specifically, as these laws are what there should be in a Muslim state, regardless of their colonial origin, and a removal of these laws will in any case move towards more secularization of society? Also, is there a third way here? That's the first one. And the second one from Khurram Rafiq. Speaking of Pakistan, in parallel, there are movements, for example, Tanzim-e-Islami, who claim to follow the Prophet's manhaj, and in the process and in process following it to achieve the Khilafah. Although it is not actually politically active, but are working in the capacity of education via Quran colleges, etc., and also have foothold in intelligentsia or academia, but have not been able to gain so. What do you think in the long term? What do you think in the long term will be their future role? So one question on Tanzim Islami and the others on blasphemy laws in the context of decolonization.
Okay, I mean, I think two things very quickly. The blasphemy laws are there, are not necessary in the current shape they're in to protect the secularization of Pakistan. They're not there. They're there to make up for the fact that you have a elite, as I've said before, I've written somewhere, the people who have ruled Pakistan for the most of the time don't believe in it, and those who believe in it have never really ruled in it. And that is what those blasphemy laws are, simply little scraps on the table to make sure that they're happy. They are, most of the time, they are too prone to too many injustices in a state which is considers itself to be Muslim. You don't need them. This is an English concept anyway, English law concept, but also, so that's the first thing. And I don't think they're the most impressing issue, but they're just markers of injustice. On the issue about, what I would answer this, one of the attempts, and this is where I think the early Islamicist pioneers, people like, who respect greatly, like thinkers like Maududi or Sayyid Qutb or Khomeini or Shariati, all of them, and even before that, there was a certain element in which they're reading or trying to construct a Islamic alternative based on a certain understanding of what's been happening in Europe in relation to, for example, Marxism and communism, etc. What that means is that they often think, because one of the things about Marxism was the idea that it was both a science as well as an ideology. That in a sense, the ideology came from the fact of a scientific understanding of society, which then allowed you to theoretically transform society along that recognition. I don't think Islam needs to make the claim that it's a science. It's not the mission of the Prophet and those who follow him. It's not that it understands society per se. It's actually something goes beyond that. It says that it is fulfilling a divine commandment. Understand, it's not a critique of particular social conditions per se. That's irrelevant partly. So I think any project which simply says that what we need to do is turn Islam into a science or analytics, it's actually making Islam secondary to science and analytics. And what you have is Islam, I think, as an inspiration. It transcends any kind of human form of knowledge in that way. And therefore, it doesn't, we should be inspired by it, we should try and follow it, but it doesn't necessarily provide us with unproblematic analytics. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a literature within the tradition, interpretive tradition, which does try and do that work. And then it's a work of creative recovery, articulation, reconfiguration of that. But I think it's important not to confuse the purpose of Islam. Islam is not a second-hand Marxism or Marxism or a second-hand science.
Great, thank you very much. Any other thoughts from Dr. Anjum or Dr. SherAli on those questions? No. Okay, let's go then to what I think may be our final two questions, both from Brother Ismail Gad. The first, how and where can Muslims test or micro-model Ummatic ideas before launching or expanding them to a global scale? And the second, what role does cultural production play in recalling the Caliphate in our spatial imagination? Any volunteers to go first on that one? Dr. Anjum, perhaps?
So I'll respond to the first question, which is that so Ummatics is very much already global if you just look at the participants here. But we do also think, and it's very important for us to recognize that, as has been pointed out earlier, we are Muslim intellectuals, scholars, thinkers, leaders, based in in the West, based in the very same entities that have both colonized the world, in recent past, but also have so successfully done so that the Muslim world institutions can't really have any of their own identity. And as such, our role here is not as simple as part of a binary of Islam versus the West. So I see the purpose, the goal of Ummatics is not so much to participate in this binary struggle, because I don't think, institutionally speaking, there is such a thing as getting rid of the West. The West itself, to some degree, has become so fragmented that it no longer exists, in my view. What you do have is particular configurations of power that operate even in the very Western societies in which we live, of 1% versus the rest, that sort of thing. But that's the rest of the world is almost configuring itself like that, whether it's China or India. They are basically, in some ways, versions of the same secular colonial models of being and of governance. So therefore, Ummatics, in that sense, is in this alternative imagination, which draws on, like all ideas that think about the future, it draws on the past, right? There isn't anything that is futuristic, and I'm here addressing another concern, which also appears, in fact, in Salman's wonderful book on futurology, that, if you think about Marxism, for example, it is the most ultra-modern ideology, the most ultra-secularist ideology. But if you think about what is it that's going to happen at the very end of history, end of Marxist history, is that people, because property is going to be abolished, people will read books and go fishing all day. And their imagination of where that comes from is very much what they think is pre-agrarian societies, what they were before, right? So they go back to this pre-agrarian, pre-agricultural past. In the same way, all imagination of the future is, in fact, the configuration of various pasts. And it's our future, and therefore it must come from our past. That's what Ummatics is about. And our location in the West or elsewhere, geographically speaking, or the global North, is not central. That said, in the particular, if you will, the prudential aspect of our project, as Salman put it, what we have to do, we want to take that metaphor and also make it talk to the prudential projects that Muslims are undertaking anyway. And we want to inspire them, we want to empower them, enrich them. And we want to go out to various Muslim countries and have research projects there. So this is not exactly answer to the question, but rather what I thought is important to say about the project to understand its global versus local dimension. We do want to have research centers talk to us, research centers in the Muslim world, various locations in the Muslim world, to do that thinking, to talk to us by this. We want this to be very much a bilateral project, but we don't, for that reason, see ourselves as being local. We're already thinking globally.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum. Dr. Salman, would you like to come in at all on the second question with respect to cultural production and what role that plays in recalling the Caliphate in our spatial imagination?
I think one of the things that I try and make the point is that we shouldn't dismiss the cultural. Culture is really, really important in trying to help the work of imagination, and I think one of the important things would be take something like that. A lot of Muslim youth do play video games in which basically they're killing terrorists, and lo and behold, what do the terrorists look like? It's small things like that, but they actually add up. So I do think there's an important cultural work to be done, and part of it is what both Ovamir and SherAli have said in their respective interventions. It's not just a question of recovering a pristine tradition, but recovering enough to be able to make that tradition itself alive. The tradition actually is alive. It is a fact that we in our kind of have ossified. So for example, attempts to articulate, to break down the distinction between, let's say, the madrasas and universities and things like that, I think is actually a progressive move. And I agree with SherAli about the awfulness of that word, but it is a positive development. Again, it can be done badly, it can be done well. But the principle should be that we should be very, very literate on these things. One very quick example, a few years ago, a new university established in a Muslim country starts off having a department of Islamic anthropology and a department of Oriental languages. And, you know, you think, well, why would you have Islamic anthropology? What is it, you know, without recognizing what the work of anthropology was doing. So I think these are small kind of things, and it's partly to recover and articulate different kinds of horizons, but to enrich that experience rather than, and cultural work is really, really important. You can't read French language or English language press from these former colonized countries, which will not refer, for example, to figures like Shakespeare or you know, Molière or something like that, but they can hardly quote Iqbal. So I think it's really important on these small gestures, but also bigger ones, to think culturally to invest in that, and that should be seen as a major work that we can do in all kinds of spaces.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salman, and we have hit the top of the hour. That will unfortunately be the last question that we get to address today. Apologies to everybody whose questions we did not get to, but thank you nevertheless for submitting them. Jazakallah khairan to all our speakers today, Dr. Salman, Dr. Anjum, and Dr. SherAli, who unfortunately has had to jump out. We invite everybody who attended today to keep an eye on our social media channels for our upcoming events. And if you have not already, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter to get all of the Ummatics updates about our papers and our events directly to your inbox. We look forward to seeing everybody at our next event, inshallah. Jazakallah khair to everyone for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Salman. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
To be
No, thank
continued.
you. Thank you for inviting me. Inshallah, we'll be in touch again in Istanbul.
Inshallah. Absolutely.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam.